Hey everybody, welcome back. Just getting the meeting started just now. Thank you guys for being here and hope you had a great holiday break. We're just going to take a few minutes until it's 2:30 and then we will get things underway. But thanks for being here so far and for all of your hard work this semester. Hey Marissa, good to see you. Yes, it was a nice break. Didn't have this huge family gathering, but just a small, tight-knit group of us that live locally and that see each other regularly. Hey Brittany, good to see you too. But yeah, it's always nice to get a little time off to just kind of reset and prepare us for the final dash to the finish line. Hey Megan. Good afternoon. Hi Jennifer. Just a few more minutes, about 4 minutes or so. Hey Nicholas. Hey Tamara. Hey Flavio. I'm good. I've been doing well. I don't know. Had a nice big Thanksgiving meal. Just caught up on some grading. But it's a nice time of the semester for me as things start winding down a little bit. Pretty intense for a few weeks there, but I feel like things are starting to clear up a bit, so it's nice. Hey, Jasmine. Hey there, Isabel. Nice, yeah. It's a good opportunity to get that sleep in and finally get a chance to reset. Jennifer, something wrong? Well, hopefully not. I hope you're doing good. But yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I've been sleeping pretty well anyway, but there's something about having that additional time where you don't have anything in the morning that makes the rest a lot more, I think, satisfying. Okay. Just a couple minutes to go. We'll get things underway. Morning jogs. Oh yeah, it's always a good way to get things started in the day. I'm more of like an afternoon person with it. Sometimes I feel like I need to kind of get my day started a little bit and then I can focus on it. But yeah, running is a great hobby. It's a very healthy thing, and yeah, you should get the. I mean, if it was me just recommending something to you, I would say get something in Garmin's lineup. I used the Forerunner 235 for a long time, and that's a very good watch for fitness and running, and it tracks all kinds of other data like sleep and heart rate and so on. So I mean, yeah, plenty of good options though. all the way from just like a Fitbit or whatever the case may be. But yeah, I like the Garmin watch. That's why I wanted to upgrade to get a nice one. Even nicer. Okay. Ready? Oh yeah. Let's see what you think. I think that the Forerunner 235 is like it's like $200 or something, but it's a nice investment. Hey Kimberly and Melissa. Hi everybody. Okay, well, it's pretty much 2:30 for now, so I'm going to go ahead and let us get started. Welcome back, everyone, and thanks a lot for just attending and for all of your patience and hard work throughout the semester. It's been a challenging year for everybody, obviously, with the pandemic and with a lot of other, I guess, political and other social unrest that's gone on, but here we are, and we've made it to the end of this term at least, so I feel like that's something that we can all be somewhat happy for, but there's a little work left to do, and that's what we're here for now. So we're going to continue to finish up the notes on Chapter 9. We just have 2 meetings this week that are devoted to that, and then next week we'll spend both of the class meetings just going into review sessions for the final. The other thing that I guess I want you guys to remember is that you have one more homework assignment, and it's due next Monday. I sent out an announcement with some of the information about that, and I know that you've received it, but let me just kind of briefly run through some of the major details of that 4th homework assignment now that we're here in the meeting. It's basically a critical analysis of viewing of some kind of television news media broadcast. So I'm asking you to find a news television show, and I need you to watch at least 30 minutes of it, and then that's going to be the basis of a report that you're going to write. This can be news from cable, or it can be local news. So, I mean, we all know that like each evening there's like Channel 9, Channel 7, Channel 4 news. You could watch such a thing as this. There's also a lot of cable news programs. I believe in a way that there's a lot of fodder for criticism and critical analysis when it comes to some of the cable news channels, because there's perhaps a little bit more political bias that can be seen. But at any rate, yeah, you know, there's like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and others. And if that's what you choose, then you can use a news broadcast from one of those channels also. What you'll have to do is you'll have to sit down and view a 30-minute broadcast. If it's a 1-hour news hour or something, you're responsible for at least 30 minutes of it, okay? And within that 30-minute window of time, I need you to basically do a few things. You're gonna have to keep very detailed record of the exact amount of time that each story was given, okay? So that's one of the elements of the assignment that I want you to do. So you're gonna use a stopwatch or some time measurement device, whether you have an app on your phone that can count seconds and minutes or whatever the case is. I need you to bring that out, and while you're watching this viewing of 30 minutes of news, I want you to create an itemized list, which basically gives a very short 1-sentence statement of what the story was about. Like, so it could say, Donald Trump disputes election results. Georgia Secretary of State issues statement. Nuclear treaty between U.S. and Russia renegotiated. Whatever the case is, you just write it as though it was like a headline, and then in that list, you'll list all the stories that were presented within the 30-minute window, and you'll also give, in a little bracketed parenthesis, the time signature that was given to that story. So you're going to show like the number of minutes and seconds exactly that each story was broadcast for. So one of the parts of your assignment is just going to be like a list with an inventory of all the stories contained in the 30 minutes in that order, with the time signature attached, so that I know how much time was given to each story. That can also be something that is useful for your written report, because you're trying to find areas of criticism. You're trying to find fallacies, misleading rhetoric, bias, the use of graphics, music, set design, etc., to shape the viewer's perspective. And one thing that you might consider commenting on is the relative amount of time that's given to different stories. One thing that's a sort of somewhat disturbing pattern is that often some of the least significant stories in terms of their news value and newsworthiness are given more time. So like sports, weather, entertainment, celebrity gossip, this kind of stuff actually oftentimes takes up more of the actual news hour than like hard-hitting fact-based exposés on like policy or, you know, international affairs or something that has a more you know, serious import. So anyway, that's one of the reasons that I want you to keep time of all the stories. You also have to just include the name of the broadcast. So if it was like Anderson Cooper at 6 p.m. or something, whatever, the name of the show, the date and the time that it originally aired, and then the station. So name of show, station, date and time that it aired, itemized list, which contains a note about what each story was and the amount of time that was given to it. And then now after all of that, you have a two-page, roughly two-page, it could be a little more, but two-page typed essay or report where you try to provide the critical analysis. And so a successful submission, a successful assignment is going to be one that tries to find a little more fault, a little more criticism. It's not the best if you say, this was a great news hour, I really loved it, everything was perfect, and now I just have all this amazing information, and it was fun. You're going to try to have to find fallacies, misleading language or rhetoric, editing tricks, or other things that in some way are subject to fair criticism. But now, Alejandra, you say, does it matter if the news are in English or can they be in another language? Good question. And hi, Mateo, and others that have checked in since I started. Hi, guys. To your question, Alejandra, it's okay in my view if it isn't English, but I would prefer it to be domestic news. So if what you're saying is there is news from like Spanish language, but it's on American stories and issues, then that would be okay. But I don't want it to be like news from Spain or like news from Mexico or something, right? Because I want it to be something that is that I can compare with my own knowledge of the current issues in the news in America, in our domestic situation. If there aren't many fallacies, would we have to find a different news broadcast? Well, I mean, everything can be criticized in some way. Even if you say, well, the substance and the importance and the impact of these stories was kind of negligible, and they spent a lot of time just with these puff pieces to try and make the viewer watch the show more and not really offend their sensibilities. I mean, that's also subject to criticism too. You do have to find fault and try to find criticism, and if you feel like you can't, then maybe you should try to look for something else. But just looking back at the history of this assignment that has been submitted to me in the past, there's been plenty of people who've succeeded at just turning in a report on like the local news, like, you know, Channel 7 News at 9. And yes, a lot of people sometimes use cable news, like opinion news shows where they have like highly opinionated and partisan hosts. And that's a very easy source of criticism depending on which side you're looking at. No, it's not about finding 20 fallacies at all, Kimberly. That's not the point. It's not like I need you to get points by saying one of the fallacies, and if you miss some of them, that's points off. No. I just want you to overall write a report where you're trying to be critical, and if you see some of the fallacies at all, then mention them, bring them into your analysis, and that just shows that you've got more of the course concepts in your final written homework assignment. It's basically like the capstone assignment where you get to demonstrate your knowledge of all the different concepts that we've learned throughout the class. So that's not merely limited to fallacies. That's also like the quality of the person's argument, whether they're employing rhetoric, and all of that. So no, Kimberly, you don't strictly have to talk about every fallacy. I wouldn't even expect a person to probably refer to half of them. But if you have the ability to mention some, then that's better than nothing, okay? So Eric, did I give you a good answer for your question? If there's not that many fallacies in one show, could you find a different news broadcast? Sure, but in line with the second comment that I just responded to, it's not only about finding and seeking out fallacies. It's about a general critique, which may employ discussion of fallacies, but may also involve, like, you know, bias, rhetoric, manipulative music, set design, editing, and all of the rest. So don't limit yourself just to a narrow focus on, like, where is naturalistic fallacy here? Where is strawman? I mean, it's not necessarily that type of assignment. It's more criticism of media, and fallacies can be used as one element of that. Clarissa, so when we write about it, do we have to use the timestamps when we are referring to a part from the video? No, your written report can just sort of summarize what you thought was of interest in the viewing hour. But the itemized list does have to show each story included in the whole 30-minute viewing period with the amount of time that was designated in terms of how much airtime it got. That's what the time signature is for. But you don't have to, for example, in your written report be like, oh, at 1:23 they started to say this or that. That would be too granular, and I'm not asking for that. Okay, does that make sense? So hopefully that's clear. Flavio, recommend any news broadcast to watch? I find that the highly partisan like news / opinion of, I don't know, either more right or left-leaning anchors would be a fair and easy source of criticism. I mean, like if you're watching Tucker or Hannity, or I don't know, on the other side of the spectrum, Maddow, or what's the guy's name? Lawrence, the other MSNBC anchor. I'm forgetting his name right now. Jeez. Lawrence O'Donnell. Yeah, so he's also highly partisan on the left. You know, sometimes those will be easy to find criticism of because they're going to sometimes stray from neutral presentation. Okay, and then here's the other thing. I know that sometimes, especially nowadays, people don't have as much of a World News Tonight with David Muir is one. Okay, that's another option. There's plenty. You know, I don't want to instruct you as to what site or source to use, but you're going to do your best and try to find criticisms. And I think we all know the type of content where that can be found and discussed. I was going to say that some of us maybe don't have the same kind of cable package or television access. So I want you to use TV to the maximum extent possible. But I'll get to that, Matteo. But in general, I want it to be TV. But if there's like no option at all for TV and you have to watch something that's been archived to the internet, then it still has to be something that was originally broadcast as a television news show and has simply been republished on whatever their YouTube channel or something is. So that's an option of last resort for those that can't watch it on television itself. But again, I'm saying it can't be like a YouTube blogger or some kind of random, not accredited news so-called source. It has to be like something that could have been seen on television, but if you were not able to watch it in that way, then as a substitute, you can find the online version of it that's been rebroadcast. Now, you asked, Matteo, could it be The Daily Show with Trevor Noah? I actually did say in the detailed class announcement that I sent out that I don't want it to be comedy or satire news, even though a lot of times, and I would not disagree, a lot of times there actually is pretty good news and factual information, even in like The Daily Show with Trevor Noah or what is it with John Oliver, you know. So there's a couple of different interesting and fun like Comedy Central news shows or whatever, but I want it to be at least something that purports to be straight news. Otherwise, it'll be too easy to find inapplicable criticisms because like when people are using humor, they oftentimes use hyperbole and they may sometimes deviate from clear standards of logical reasoning, but they do it for humorous effect. So I kind of didn't want us to mix the different modalities of news show, but I do appreciate the idea because I agree that those are sometimes very informative and also entertaining. But we're going to focus more on something that at least claims to be news of the standard variety. Okay, and here's one more thing too. I don't want you to use a show that only specializes on like one or two stories. Sometimes there's a news hour, but it's like a news special feature. And it's like the whole hour is dedicated to just like one or two issues. If that was the case, then you wouldn't have that much material to report on. So I do want it to be like a traditional variety news hour where there's a whole bunch of different stories that the news crew covers. It can't just be like special feature on COVID-19 pandemic and the whole thing is just on that, or the whole thing is just on like Trump's election litigation or something, you know. So make sure that it's not one of those type of news shows that's all solely dedicated to one or even two stories. Okay, so that's everything I guess I had to tell you about that. You'll just submit it to me as an email with an attached file, no later than the class time, 2:30 p.m. of next Monday, what would that be, the 7th. So that's the last and fourth homework assignment. Other than that, we're just building towards the final. Everything else before this has been graded so far. And I did say to you guys in my message over the break that if you want any of your scores, just ask, and I'll send you a detailed breakdown of your current grade with all the scores included. I believe everybody that emailed me over the break as late as Saturday has gotten a response. If there's anyone that's sent a new message as of yesterday or today, I'll be getting to it in the next day or so. But I invite anybody else that has any interest in looking at their previous scores to simply just check with me for a grade check, and I'll get back a reply to you within like 48 hours or so at the most. Okay, so it should be 12-point font. It's fine to have it double spaced, but if you need to exceed the page length, then that's okay. I have no problem with you going a little bit over if you needed more space to finish whatever you're writing. So any other questions or anything about that? I wanted to make sure we were clear about the last homework assignment before we move on to some more lecture. But if that's good and everyone's on the same page, then I guess I'll leave it at that for now. If you have more questions at any point, you can feel free to ask, whether it's in this meeting or an email to me or whatever the case is. Yes, I say 12-point font, double spaced, roughly 2 pages, but it can go over and beyond 2 if you do need it. So that's correct. Okay, so then I guess let's just jump back into the last chapter that we're going to study in this class, which is chapter 9, and that's all about ethics. So we've already started a little bit of our discussion of ethics last time, and I'll go back into some of that as just a review. Ethics is the area of philosophy and just thought that deals with morality, the study of morality and moral concepts. And so within the realm of morality, ethics, moral concepts, we have ideas like what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's moral or what's immoral, how a person morally should or shouldn't act, what's just, what's unjust. You know, all of these kind of contrasting moral terms and concepts give a sense of what we are thinking about when we study and consider ethics. We talked about how there are 3 main categories of moral action within ethics. There's actions defined as morally impermissible, which means they're wrong and they're not okay to do, like, I don't know, murder, rape, genocide, theft, all kinds of stuff that's morally impermissible. Contrary to that, there are actions that are morally permissible, which means that they're not wrong and they are okay to do. So, I don't know, attending a lecture, riding a bike, I don't know, whistling as you walk down the street. You know, these are all morally permissible. They're not wrong. It could also include things that have a bigger positive impact, like donating blood or working at a homeless shelter, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But it's anything that's just not wrong. And then there's also morally obligatory actions. And those are the actions that you must do, and it would be wrong not to do them. So I don't know, like paying the bill after you've already eaten the food, or keeping a promise that you have made, or a vow that you've entered into. Also the non-performance of all the impermissible acts, that would be obligatory also. So we also talked about how moral reasoning is when you or me or any person makes a decision for themselves about what's right or wrong, or about what they should or shouldn't do. And so we engage in moral reasoning as we ourselves judge whether an act is good or bad. And sometimes we are the judge, and sometimes we're the subject of other people's moral judgment. We talked about the difference between law and morality, that although they overlap quite a bit, that it's possible, and of course there are cases in history where the law and morality seem to divide. Like there could be laws that permit conduct that's wrong, like slavery, or there could be laws that prohibit conduct that is not wrong, like, I don't know, recreational drug use, if some people think that that's not wrong. So we try to see a dividing line between ethics and law, even though for the most part we hope that they overlap. After this, we started to discuss the different types of values there are, moral values and non-moral values. The moral values are values that benefit you and other people, and they're considered good for their own sake. So that includes stuff like forgiveness, justice, altruism. Non-moral values are more goal-oriented, and they're only desired as a means to an end. So that includes concepts like popularity, wealth, fame, or prestige. They're merely in the interest of your self-interest that you value those things. And the reason we want them is because we think they're a means to the attainment of personal happiness or pleasure. It mentions in the book that you should balance both types of values in your everyday life. And yeah, fair enough, diet caffeine-free Coke. I mean, there is sugar in there, so you could still get a little bit of a sugar buzz, I guess. But maybe the example couldn't have been better. I just went with the first thing that came off the top of my head. Prohibited conduct under the law that's not wrong. I don't know. I mean, I gave before the case of abortion, right? Abortion's legal under the law, but some people think it's immoral. I guess I was trying to think of something illegal in the law that's not necessarily immoral. Maybe, can you think of a case like that? Illegal by law, but not really wrong? Oh, well, okay, I guess freeing a slave, there you go. Freeing a slave in the time of slavery would have been a criminal act, but I don't think most people would argue that that was an unjust or immoral, evil action to do. And so again, law can sometimes codify behavior that's not itself moral. But anyway, I digress. We moved on to talk quickly about what is the conscience. The conscience is some innate source of knowledge about what's right or wrong. They say that we are born with it, at least in the normal course of events, we're born with it, and it's something that we can either develop or allow to become weak and undeveloped. So that's the conscience, this internal source of knowledge about right and wrong. Okay, so next up, we're just going to continue developing this chapter and some of the main terms that are in it. We talked about, or we're going to talk next about what are moral sentiments. Okay, so moral sentiments are emotions that we sometimes have which alert us to a moral situation, and they cause us to want to do what is right. So, okay, moral sentiments. So built into us are the capacity to feel certain type of emotions when we're in the midst of a moral situation, a situation that has some kind of moral significance. So, I mean, if you found yourself all of a sudden seeing somebody robbed or abused or treated disrespectfully, your moral sentiments might at that point kick in, and you might, even if you're a bystander or somewhat uninvolved, you might feel like I should do something to try and prevent this bad behavior or to cause it to stop. So when we get those feelings, we take offense at something, or we feel righteous about something, morally speaking, we're feeling these moral sentiments. And there's actually a little rundown of a couple of them that are mentioned in the book. So included in the category of moral sentiments, they mention the concept of helper's high. I don't know if I'm 100% behind the terminology that's used here, because high makes it sound like it's like a drug intoxicating thing, but it's just a metaphor. What a helper's high is this phenomenon where you feel good about yourself when you do something that is helpful to other people. So when you help others, and then you feel good about yourself as a result. Okay, so there's actually some scientific evidence to suggest that there is in fact a kind of chemical reaction in the brain when you do something that is beneficial or of benefit to other people, like a reaction in which neurotransmitters release dopamine in the brain and actually causes you to have a sensation of feeling satisfied and content with yourself. So it means there's sort of like almost a built-in reinforcement mechanism given to us by nature that causes us to want to cooperate and be helpful towards each other. Many animal species, of course, work cooperatively. You can see bees working together in colonies to create beehives. You can see, beavers sometimes working throughout even generations that extend throughout their whole life to build these giant dams and so on in the woods. But it's only humans like us that can cooperate in the very highly specialized ways that lead to the existence of technology, culture, and all the trappings of modernism that we kind of take for granted all the time. So there's something that's built into us that makes us want to help each other and be cooperative. We have to sometimes overcome our own tendency towards self-interest and disinterest in the lives and well-being of others. But it's not something that is completely alien or foreign to us as human beings. So helper's high is that familiar feeling of feeling content, satisfied, a kind of pat on the back that you get from yourself for being a just helpful, good person that's a benefit to others. So helper's high is one of the moral sentiments. I'm going to clear the board so I can create space for a few more. So empathy can also be mentioned as one of these moral sentiments. Empathy is the capacity to be to imagine and care about the feelings of others. Okay, so empathy is another one of the important moral sentiments. What empathy is, as you can see it defined here, the ability to inhabit the perspective of another person and feel what they're feeling. So if you have empathy and there's another person and you can see that they're experiencing pain, loss, suffering, an empathic person isn't just neutral to that, like, okay, they're suffering, whatever. You know, you feel a little of their pain, or at least you can imagine what they're going through and you care about the fact that they're feeling that way. So empathy is another one of the moral sentiments. It alerts us to the fact that sometimes people are experiencing hardship, maybe sometimes people are suffering. I guess you can also have empathy towards a positive emotion, right? If someone's feeling very happy, your empathy may allow you to experience the sort of exuberance or optimism or, you know, happiness that they are feeling as well. But oftentimes empathy is something that we refer to when we're talking about your ability to care for another person's suffering or loss. Now, compassion is closely connected to empathy, and they mention them kind of in tandem in the book. Compassion, they say, is just empathy in action. Meaning that compassion is when you actually start to try and take concrete steps to relieve another person's suffering or harm. Instead of just kind of relating to it, feeling touched by it. Compassion is when you take that additional step to try and help the person, make them feel better, or do something to improve on their psychological state. So compassion is another one of the important moral sentiments. If we didn't have that type of feeling, then we would just be totally insensitive and unconcerned with the well-being of others. And that would be no kind of world that any of us would want to live in, because sometimes, you know, we are the benefactor of the compassion and goodwill that others show to us. So we just want to be, I hope, you know, participants in the same kind of process, paying it forward, right, in a way, be nice to other people. And even if it doesn't come back down to you, it's bound to show itself in that person's future dealings, either with you or with others. So there's also compassion. But, you know, here's the thing. These moral sentiments, they're not all just, you know, fun and positive. There's also, you know, some harm, or I shouldn't say harm, but there's some negative moral sentiments. That doesn't mean that they're bad, though, because negative moral sentiments, we also have to be in touch with them because they alert us to when things can be better. And one of those is what the book refers to as moral outrage. Moral outrage, that's when you perceive something that you think is unjust, and then you become upset on the basis of that. So when you perceive an injustice and become upset, that is the experience of moral outrage. So moral outrage. A lot of times stuff happens in our world, and we can see it a lot of times on the news, whether it's police brutality, I don't know, discrimination against certain minorities or women or older people, business practices that may in some ways compromise the health of the community or even the planet. When things like that happen, many times a person can feel a sense of umbrage, a sense of outrage, righteous indignation, like that's something that's bad, that's something that shouldn't happen, that's something that you say, oh, I reject and I stand opposed to that. Well, when you have those feelings, you're in touch with the sense of moral outrage, and that again is one of the moral sentiments that causes you to maybe want to do at least your small part to help contribute to a solution that rectifies or restores justice to the situation. So you can feel moral outrage just because you perceive some injustice, even if you're not necessarily harmed by it directly. Another one of these moral sentiments that's slightly different from moral outrage, but it's in the same ballpark, is resentment. Let me explain to you the difference, though, between moral outrage and resentment. Okay, so resentment is just like a more personal form, basically, of moral outrage. It occurs when you yourself have been the victim of some unjust behavior or act, and then you become upset because of that. So resentment, when you yourself are the victim of some injustice and then become upset. Resentment. So as an example, take the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s in the United States, and think of the Montgomery bus boycotts that were initially led by Rosa Parks. So if you know a little about your recent history, you probably know this fact that back then, in the wake of the whole segregation and Jim Crow era, there were certain holdovers from our, somewhat racist past involving slavery, where black people were asked to set aside their seats at the front of a bus if a white patron came onto the bus and there was no seated room. So basically, like, black people were treated as second-class citizens because they were asked to move to the back of the bus so that the white patrons could occupy the seats at the front. Now, Rosa Parks, of course, was one person who felt that this was a disrespect and an indignity to black people, and therefore led and helped to orchestrate the Montgomery bus boycotts. And these boycotts caused such, loss of revenue to the bus operator and system that they became aligned with the social justice reforms of the civil rights era, which culminated, of course, in a Civil Rights Act signed by LBJ and the, luminary figures of Martin Luther King and et cetera, et cetera. But okay, if you had been, let's suppose, like a white citizen at that time, therefore not disenfranchised or discriminated against by means of this white patrons get a seat rule, you had been the benefactor of such a rule. But you still could have felt moral outrage on the behalf of those aggrieved citizens that had been treated with disrespect and discrimination. If you had been, though, like, a black citizen of the United States at that time, subjected to this treatment, then you would have felt more than just moral outrage at the existence of some unjust behavior, but you would have felt resentment because it is you who's been treated unfairly directly, rather than some other person who you observe and become upset on their behalf. So, moral outrage and resentment are kind of like that. A lot has been spoken of this year about, and not just this year, but in many of the recent years, about like, is it only frozen for you, is your question, Jamie? Well, let me ask to the others, because I see your comment. Never mind, Jamie, is it all good? I see your comment, and maybe it froze on your end for a bit. Can anyone else here tell me the status of the connection for the moment? Are you all hearing me and seeing these things pretty clear for the time being? Who can let me know? I know there's plenty of us here. So I'm sorry, what is the no? Okay. The initial statement no was in connection to a different question. So it seems like we're good. Thank you guys. Just checking. Got to make sure. Okay. All I was saying is that, yeah, like in the current day, taking it away from history more to the current day, we've seen the George Floyd racial, the social justice protests and et cetera that have been going on all year. I mean, I'm not in the social category personally of those that might be subjected to this type of police brutality according to the consensus that's been established around, criticism in the media and also just by the public of police conduct in these cases. So basically, I'm white and I'm a guy, and there's a lot of discrimination, sexism, and racism that I don't necessarily get subjected to, but I still feel the sense of injustice, and I still feel the sense of aggrievement because of the existence of this social fact. On the other hand, if you yourself are in the category of any person, whether it's in a marginalized group or otherwise, that's been subjected to injustice, and that's not to say that people in majority groups cannot also be victim of injustice, but I'm just providing an example. Resentment would be the phenomenon, or at least the term used to refer to it. Okay, so let's go on a little bit more, some more of these moral sentiments to discuss. In connection with the conscience and the moral sentiments, there's also the idea of guilt and shame. So let me go over that with you guys. Guilt. Guilt is a bad feeling that results from having committed some kind of wrong. So a bad feeling that alerts you to and motivates you to correct a wrong. So, I mean, guilt can affect you when you do something bad or wrong. You cheat in school, on your partner, lie to people, maybe your parents or something. You could perhaps get away with it, but sometimes your conscience will kick in and you'll feel a sense of personal guilt. So guilt is that thing that's telling us that we did something wrong and maybe we should either try to make amends or just correct our own behavior. People respond to with humility and resistance. I think you've probably heard people make this comment: "Don't give me a guilt trip. Why are you trying to guilt me?" But that is something that I believe could be taken too far. What kind of person doesn't feel guilt at all? What kind of person could do anything and never feel any guilt? That's a psychopath. That's a sociopath. And you don't want to be that kind of person, because if you are, then you're not healthy and something's definitely wrong with you. You've got to feel guilt if you do things that are wrong. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you're in touch with your own conscience and that you try to stay to the correct course. So we don't like experiencing guilt because it's not a fun feeling. But if we never had any attachment to the feeling, or if we never listened to our own conscience, then we would be able to commit wrongdoing without impunity, and eventually that's going to redouble back to us as harm, or at least something that we're bound to regret. And we're also going to be judged negatively by others if we persist in a bad pattern of behavior. So guilt is something that, although it's not fun, and a person that feels no guilt is a psychopath, and that's also something that nobody wants to be. So in a way, you should be grateful and happy for the fact that you can experience guilt and that you can at least try to find a better way to behave in the future. There's also a difference between guilt and shame, and the textbook mentions this. So let me try and distinguish the two concepts. Shame. Shame is a negative feeling, but it happens when you violate a social norm. So it's a negative feeling that results from the violation of a social norm, but it's possible to feel shame without guilt. And let me go into that in just a moment. So Okay, bad feeling that results from violating a social norm. That's the concept of shame. So let's think about this if we can. How could a person experience shame without guilt? That would be if the person thought that what they did was contrary to a social norm, but not what? Can you give me the quick analysis that I'm looking for here? What is shame without guilt? It would be when one feels badly because they did something that's considered abnormal or weird, basically socially. So they stepped outside of social conventions and norms. But how could the same person not experience guilt? Right, okay, good, Miguel. If they thought they did something that was kind of weird and unconventional, so they feel ashamed, but they don't feel guilty because they didn't actually do anything wrong, morally speaking. So I don't know, if you went to like a part of the world where there was a certain custom in terms of how to dress, perhaps scantily clad, like an indigenous culture, right? So you touch down as like a Westerner in common clothing that you're wearing, and imagine that everyone looking at you is laughing at you and like, this person's hilarious, look at their ridiculous outfit. In that society, relative to that culture, you're doing something that's not normal. And so you might feel a little embarrassed even, like, geez. But you don't really feel guilt because you don't necessarily feel, I would assume, that like to wear, you know, a t-shirt and jeans or whatever the case may be for you, that that's something immoral. It's just not looked at as normal behavior in that case. So shame and guilt can be distinguished from each other. They mention in the book that this could have been experienced in prior generations when openness to like LGBTQ and all these different gender identities and lifestyles, sexual orientations were suppressed. So like, I don't know, think of the world of America in the 1950s. If a person was just born gay, you know, and so they feel like I had no choice in the matter, then they could still feel some kind of shame by being subject to the taboo that says people are not normally gay or whatever. But if they didn't feel that they did anything wrong, you know, morally speaking, then that's another case of like shame without guilt. So don't always assume that a bad feeling that you have means that you have done something wrong. Sometimes you might just feel a little bit embarrassed or ashamed because you're doing something that a convention says is abnormal. But the violation of a convention is not necessarily always the same thing as unethical conduct. And so knowing the difference allows us to see how those concepts can be compared. Maybe I can read a little from the book and you can then see how the book mentions this. So, it says here on page 274, guilt both alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong that we have committed. Guilt is a lot like pain. When you cut yourself, you feel pain at the site of the injury. The pain causes you to want to repair the injury before it becomes infected. Guilt also motivates us to avoid harming ourselves and others. We refrain from cheating on an exam or from stealing someone's laptop, even when no one is around to take it. Even when no one is around to see us take it, because the very thought of doing it makes us feel guilty. Guilt is frequently regarded as a barrier to personal freedom and happiness. Some of us respond to guilt with resistance, either trying to ignore it or getting angry at a person who made us feel guilty. But at the same time, we will generally regard a person who feels no guilt as a sociopath, an inhuman monster. This uncertainty about the nature of guilt stems in part from a confusion of guilt with shame. Guilt is often broadly defined to include shame, however the two are different. Guilt results when we commit a moral wrong. Shame, on the other hand, occurs as the result of violating a social norm or not living up to someone else's expectations for us. So teenagers who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual may feel shame for not living up to the expectations of their family, church, or society, but they generally would not feel guilt. So rather than motivating us to do better, shame leaves us feeling humiliated and embarrassed. And as good critical thinkers, we should know the difference between the two things, guilt and shame. So there you go, more discussion that follows from this expanded mention of the moral sentiments and what they involve. So the next thing in this chapter 9 that we'll talk about are what are called the stages of moral development. The development of moral reasoning in a person's life. According to at least one famous psychologist and researcher, Lawrence Kohlberg, who worked at Harvard as a professor, he studied the concept of moral development, and he basically believed that a human being, and he thought this was universal so that it spanned across all different global cultures, So it's not just like a Western or Eastern thing that's somewhat universal to the human condition, but that human beings overall, in his studies, he found that we develop morally in 3 possible stages, and that not everyone reaches the 3rd and highest level of moral development. But now we're going to have to talk about those 3 stages and what they are. It seems like 3 is the magic number sometimes in a lot of these famous psychologists doing research. Remember, if you will, that back in the beginning of the class, we talked about the stages of cognitive development, right? Dualism, relativism, commitment. The book included discussion of the 3 stages of the critical thinking process: experience, interpretation, and analysis. And now, yet again, we see a 3-way breakdown of stages involved in the development of your moral reasoning across your life. So let's see what these 3 stages are. Okay, so first of all, this is the guy whose research that we are talking about. His name is Lawrence Kohlberg, and he did live from 1927 until 1987. So 60 years, and he was a psychologist and a researcher at Harvard. So this is his biggest, legacy that he left behind, this description of the 3 stages of moral development. So 3 stages of moral development. Let's get started with stage number 1 here. So the first one, he calls it the pre-conventional stage of moral development. Okay, the second stage that comes after that would be the conventional stage. And I'm going to define and explain each one, but I just want to list them first. So after the pre-conventional, you have just the conventional. Okay, and then you've got the 3rd stage coming next, and that is the post-conventional stage of moral development. Okay, so let's get started with the top here. First, pre-conventional stage of moral development. Thinking about this stage, you got to think about the basic, the most rudimentary, basic level of moral thinking that little children would have, and comparatively unsophisticated adults. So this is the point of your moral development where you basically think that morality is all just about avoiding punishment for yourself. So morality is all about avoiding punishment. That's the pre-conventional level of moral development. So, for example, if your mind is at that level of moral development, then why do you think someone would say that it's wrong to steal? Pre-conventional moral outlook. The person with this level of moral thinking, if they believed stealing was wrong, they would say, why is it? What's the reason that stealing's wrong to the pre-conventional moral thinker? I think you can tell me based on the definition and just your own intuition and common sense. What would be the reason to say that it's wrong at the pre-conventional level? Because you could be punished, right? So maybe you get caught. What if you get caught stealing? Then you're going to be hit with a fine or maybe jail time or some kind of sanction. So don't steal, but only because there's a penalty that you could face. A little child, right, at school might want to, like, I don't know, harass another student, pull their hair or something. But they don't do it because they see that there's the teacher. And they're like, well, if I do that, then the teacher's going to find out. They'll see that I did it, and then they're going to put me on timeout or tell my parents or whatever, right? If it's a little kid dealing with their parents, they might say, well, I was thinking of, I don't know, lying to my parents about what I did today, but if they find out, then they're going to ground me or spank me or something. And so I'm fearful of that punishment. And that's all that matters morally. So whatever's good is just what I don't get punished for, and whatever's bad is what I could get punished for. But if you're at this pre-conventional level of moral development, it's relatively underdeveloped and unsophisticated because you can't see any reason to behave well absent the threat of a penalty. In a way, this is kind of an egotistic moral outlook, and that's shown in the book by means of a little diagram that they draw. So they basically draw two circles. One of them they label me, and then the other one they label others. When you're at the pre-conventional stage of your moral development, the circle that depicts me is just much larger because it's very self-centered. You don't necessarily care about other people. That's not the reason that you want to do the right thing. You just care about avoiding punishment for yourself. So it's very egoistic. It's like, I would rob you, but if I get caught, then I'm in trouble. I don't care about you. I care about myself not getting caught. So that's very self-centered. And this little diagram was given in the book to kind of give a pictorial depiction of that. Me, others. Others, not so important. Me, though, that's very important. And if I get punished, that's the number one thing that I don't want. So that's pre-conventional level of moral development. You know, sadly, there are people who will go through their lives without advancing to the next stage. And so you might even have encountered people like that. You know, they're full-blown adults out there, reasonable adults, but they're still just thinking there's no such thing as right and wrong. There's just, I want to avoid getting caught doing things that could be punitive against me. Okay, now the next stage is the conventional stage of moral development. And at that conventional stage, it's kind of like a big 180 turn from this stage, because now you're totally concerned with the fitting into the norms and conventions of the society that you're in, hence the name conventional. So now you really, really want to fit into the norms and conventions so that you will be perceived by other people as like a good boy or a nice girl. That's the language used by Kohlberg, so I'm just using his language. So here we say that one wants to adhere to social norms and conventions to be seen as a good boy or nice girl. Okay, a little bit cramped, but what it says, I can read it again, is conventional. One wants to adhere to social norms and conventions in order to be seen as a good boy or nice girl. So unlike at the pre-conventional stage, where it's just punishment that you're seeking to avoid, now it's kind of like approval that you want from the social fabric and the community that you're a part of. So you want to just stick to the conventions and the norms and the expectations, because if you do, then that's going to be socially rewarded and you'll be seen as a good boy or a nice girl. So it's less about avoiding penalty as much as fitting in with what's considered normal for the sake of being approved of by other people. So that's a little bit different than the first stage. You recognize that there is like a set of social norms and conventions that exist and you want to follow along with them. At that stage, it kind of flips the orientation of these two circles. In the book, that means that they show the circles in the opposite order. I'm going to erase here and then I'll put that up here so that I have more room. But the little diagram, which I'm sure you can imagine, is just this one now. That the circle that stands for others is much larger than the one that stands for me. I just want to do what everyone else expects me to do. I want to fit into the norm. I want to be part of what's conventional, what's considered normal and conventional and appropriate. But then, you know, you might get all the way to the third and highest level of moral development. And Lawrence Kohlberg says that less than 10% of adults reach this highest and third level of moral development, which is called post-conventional. So let me explain that. You've got his name up here, and you know the heading of this topic, so I'm erasing that. And then the third stage, let's just continue it up here. The third stage of moral development, post-conventional. Okay, so at the post-conventional stage of moral development, a person applies universal moral principles based on their own judgment. And the conclusions they reach may in some cases differ from the judgment of society as a whole. Okay, so this is where you kind of have your own independent moral outlook, but it's informed by your values, and your moral judgment and principles that you accept. So what it says is one applies universal moral principles based on their own judgment, and the conclusions they reach based on that judgment will sometimes be different from the social norm. So now it's like you're doing the right thing, but not just because you're afraid of penalty, not just because you want everyone to like you and approve of you and think that you're normal, but just because you recognize that it's right based on your own moral intuition and your sense of justice. And at that post-conventional level, the circles that stand for me and others are brought into balance, so they're basically of the same size. That's where you would have this kind of diagram showing me, others. Because the judgments and the expectations of the other members of society, you take that on board and you take that by way of advisement. But you don't think that it's final and authoritative because your own moral judgment looms large and has to be weighed against it and balanced against it. So like a person who would free slaves in the time of slavery would be at this post-conventional level of moral development because it's not normal and it's actually punished in society, but they recognize that that's the right thing to do, even though their moral judgment has led them to a conclusion that is to the contrary of the social expectation or even the law. So let me read a little bit from the book. Let me make one more point about what the book says on this before I read this. The book, I thought, kind of overcomplicates the three stages in a way because it divides each one into two parts. So if you actually go to our book and you look at like page 277, you're going to see that where it talks about pre-conventional, it's like pre-conventional part 1 and 2, and then conventional part 1 and 2, and post-conventional part 1 and 2. But I thought that there was not enough substance to distinguish the two sub-stages to make mention of that. So I'm in a way streamlining it for you. We've got three main stages: pre, conventional, and post. And here's the way it's talked about in our book. So Kohlberg, Harvard psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, according to him, people advance through distinct stages in the development of their moral reasoning capability. These stages are transcultural, that is, they are found in every culture of the world, right? So you can read about his actual research and you see that he did case studies, not just in one area, but geographically throughout the globe. So he thought he was identifying something that's really rooted in human nature. Anyway, each new stage represents increased proficiency in critical thinking skills and greater satisfaction with your moral decisions. So Kohlberg identified 3 levels of moral development, each with 2 subparts. But in the first stage, what Kohlberg called the pre-conventional stage, morality is defined egotistically in terms of oneself. People at this level expect others to treat them morally, but generally don't treat other people with respect or morality unless doing so benefits them. Most, though not all people, outgrow the pre-conventional stage by high school, but most criminals are at that stage. Nearly half of all crimes are committed by people between the age of 15 and 24. Okay, but next we say here's the conventional stage. People at the conventional stage look to others for moral guidance. Earning the approval of others and conforming to norms of their peers are especially important to people at this stage. For example, Lindy England, one of the American guards in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq, where some of our U.S. soldiers manning prison facilities in Iraq were abusing some of the detainees that we had custody of. She stated in her defense that she chose to do what my friends wanted me to do, and the judge rejected that plea. So she's trying to say that I just did what I thought was considered normal within the peer group that I was then operating within. It says most high school seniors and college freshmen are at this stage in their moral development. This is associated with the first stage of cognitive development, in which students believe that there are right and wrong answers and that those in authority know those answers. The next stage of conventional moral reasoning involves substituting the norms and laws of the wider culture for peer group norms, cultural relativism. Now that's all still within the conventional stage. Here we get to the post-conventional. At the post-conventional stage of moral reasoning, people recognize that social conventions need to be justified. The fact that something is the law does not make it moral or just. Instead, moral decisions should be based on universal moral principles and on concerns such as justice, compassion, and mutual respect. A person's stage of moral development is correlated with his or her behavior. And now we get a couple of facts about the breakdown of responses given by people in the different categories. Researchers found that only 9% of people at the pre-conventional stage and 38% of people at the conventional stage would offer help to someone who is suffering from the side effects of a drug. But everyone at the post-conventional stage did offer their assistance. And then it mentions that less than 10% of American adults reach that post-conventional level of moral reasoning. If you stay stuck or you stall out at the earlier stages, it tends to lead you to come up with simpler moral solutions when you reason. And when they don't work or backfire, you become frustrated or baffled. So we want to keep developing and growing morally and just intellectually. And this kind of charts out the basic progress that a person does make as they go through the series of stages of life, if they can continue to grow and change. There's a brief discussion that follows after that of some scenarios that were presented to college freshmen to sort of gauge their level of moral development. And they gave the question about a fictional character named Joe. They say, suppose that you imagine there's a neighbor who discovers that his neighbor Joe is actually a fugitive of justice. So this is a person who's escaped from prison, and they've been living free for years. But suppose they've been living a model life. You know, they're a model citizen. For all you know, your neighbor Joe is like the best person, who's one of the most kind pillars of the community. So students were asked, should the neighbor turn this person into the authorities, since they are, after all, someone who's escaped prosecution or whatever, or prison? Should they be turned in? Well, here were the different responses. Freshmen were most likely to say yes, because that's just the law. But by the time they had reached their senior year, the responses start to show more nuance. People start asking questions like, well, what is the law? And is it actually fair for the law to be applied in this scenario? Furthermore, questions were asked by people at the post-conventional level, in the senior cohort. We want to know more about Joe. Has he really been rehabilitated? And which action would most benefit society, reporting him or not doing so? So moral reasoning plays an important role in our everyday lives and decisions, and it informs the way that we approach those kind of situations. So the last thing then we'll talk about today, and then we'll spend the whole meeting on Thursday going into further detail on this. What are some different moral theories? So there are different theories of morality which try to give answers as to what makes an action right or wrong, permissible or impermissible. And we're going to try to at least sample from and learn about some of these important moral theories that have been developed. Now, there are two main types of moral theory. So let's explain. Two types of moral theory. So one of the two types is called moral relativism. And then, to the contrary, is moral universalism. Moral relativism, moral universalism. So first off, relativism says this, that morality is relative. That it's not universal, but that what's right or wrong is something that depends. It depends. It's not a fixed, absolute, objective fact. That it's somehow more subjective or relative, as the word goes. So, okay, moral relativism. Morality is not universal or absolute, but it is relative. Moral universalism is just the opposite claim. According to this viewpoint, this moral theory, morality is universal and objective, and the same moral rule apply to all people, places, and times. So it's not like what I think is right is different from what you think is right, and we just have different opinions. No, according to moral universalism, there are facts about what's right and wrong, and they are universal, necessary, unchanging, and absolute moral facts. So that's moral universalism. Moral relativism, morality is relative. Moral universalism, morality is set in stone and is universal. We're going to talk a lot more about this kind of theory on Thursday, but for the last 10 minutes here, I want to tell you guys about two subcategories of moral relativism. So basically, moral relativism type A and moral relativism type B. So there's two subcategories that fall under this class. And one of them is what is called cultural relativism, and the other one is called ethical subjectivism. So let me start with ethical subjectivism here. So one of the two kinds of moral relativism is ethical subjectivism. So ethical subjectivism says that what morality is relative to is just the individual. So in this theory, morality is nothing more than personal opinion. Okay. Okay, and then the other type of moral relativistic theory is what we call cultural relativism. So the ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism, they agree on one point, which is that morality is not universal. But they differ as to what it is relative to. In subjectivism, it's relative to the individual. But in cultural relativism, morality is defined instead by the society or the culture of which one is a part. So, cultural relativism. Morality is based on the norms of one's culture or society. It's a backslash, culture / society there. Okay, so a lot of people I find, especially people about at your age, college age, are thinking in these relativistic terms. In a way, there's a good reason for that, because you guys have had it, I think, emphasized a lot in this current generation that we're supposed to be tolerant, that we're supposed to be open-minded to a diverse range of lifestyles, opinions, gender identities, sexual orientations, all of that. And that's a great thing. But there's also sort of a not so great aspect of that when it comes to how people think about morality, or at least it could be fairly criticized. So for example, let me ask you a question. This is going to test your knowledge of what I'm instructing you on here. Suppose that someone is an ethical subjectivist. I just have this question. Is murder wrong? Is it wrong to kill another person? According to ethical subjectivism. That's kind of a trick question, but if you can see through the trickiness of the question, maybe you can give me an answer. So tell me, is murder wrong? That should seem like an easy question. According to ethical subjectivism, though, is my question. Does this theory say murder is wrong? What do you think? Just tell me what you think. You hear the question. Murder, killing a person. Not talking about killing a person that's threatening your life or whatever, but yeah. So you're saying, Hannah, it would depend on the person's opinion. Correct, okay, true. And that's a little disturbing, isn't it? We want to be able to say that something like so wrong as murder is absolutely wrong. And it's not just, well, it depends who you're talking to. Okay, so murder's wrong to who? To the person who feels in their opinion that it's wrong. But according to ethical subjectivism, in what situation is murder not wrong? From the viewpoint of ethical subjectivism, murder is not wrong if what? Can you tell me the conclusion of that sentence? When would murder not be wrong in ethical subjectivist thought? If we're taking the viewpoint of who? I think you must know, because Hannah and you guys are giving basically the right kind of response, but just following up on that. No, Alex, because self-defense is not murder. Murder means wrongful killing. So, and Jillian, also not the example I'm talking about, because judicial execution is also not the case of murder. I'm talking about killing an innocent person without cause. Now, when is that not wrong? Well, it's not wrong to the murderer, exactly. Yeah, Clarissa, you guys are very creative, because you're thinking of cases of justified homicide. Like, okay, well, if I had to defend myself, or if I was trying to apprehend a person and they were threatening my life, or if I was in a court of law and they were sentenced to die. But I'm not talking about that case. I'm talking about like killing a person, like in the dead of night, that's just walking down the street. Is that wrong? Well, I know that you would think so, and I agree. But according to ethical subjectivism, it depends on what? It depends on whose opinion we're talking about. So to the vast majority of people with opinions that are all on the same page that that's wrong, we'd say it's wrong according to them. But to the murderer, they've got a different opinion. Imagine speaking to the murderer and you say, well, tell me, sir or ma'am, is murder wrong? And they say, well, in your opinion it is, but no, I don't think so at all, because it's like hunting. And hunting a human being is the most thrilling thing to hunt, because the most difficult to capture and subdue, because the most intelligent. So the pleasure that I derive from it is immense. I think it outweighs and overvalues the entire life that they are experiencing. So, you know, I'm the murderer now, and I'm telling you that it's one of the greatest things. I believe everyone should be out there murdering. It's great. Now, do we really want to grant legitimacy to a viewpoint like that? Probably not. But that's one of the main criticisms of ethical subjectivism. It denies you the ability to make a strong critique of that person's moral view. All you can say is, well, we have very different opinions, sir. I think that's very wrong, and you just don't. I guess we just have to agree to disagree. But don't you find that that's weak? Like, you shouldn't agree to disagree with the murderer about the case of murder being wrong. What about rape? Rape. I would say it's wrong, and I'm sure every single one of you would say the same thing. But talk to a rapist, and maybe they'll give you some weird argument. Like, I don't know, go back in time. You know, if a powerful male could physically dominate a woman, that meant that he would spread his genes. And so there's kind of like some evolutionary reason for rape to exist. Therefore, I don't even see it as a wrong action. Now you're talking to a person who has a weird viewpoint, but that's their opinion. Do we really want to say that, well, rape, it depends. Some people think it's wrong, other people don't, and there's just no fact about whether it's right or wrong. So if you want to say something a little more robust about when things are wrong, then you can't necessarily lean so heavily on ethical subjectivism, because it denies the ability to say that universally, absolutely, something is wrong. All we can say at best is, it's wrong to the opinion of me and many others, even the majority, but that's not the same thing as saying that it's factually objective. Well, let's look at cultural relativism next. Okay, cultural relativism has a little bit better ability to justify our moral intuitions than ethical subjectivism, because, for example, let me ask you this. Is it wrong to marry a child? According to cultural relativism, what do you think? Another kind of tricky question. Is it wrong to marry a child? What do you think? Cultural relativism, question on table here is, so Gabriel, you're saying no, but you need to give a little more explanation. Why are you saying no? Because I think in our society, it's not normal at all. So you're saying, okay, good, Clarissa, in America. And it just depends on the culture, that's right. Or you could say religion, but for the most part, cultural differences, right? So in some cultures, it's actually like an expected norm or rite of passage for, you know, a woman that in our society would be regarded as a child to enter into a marriage agreement. In some cultures, that's normal and expected even. So you could say that in that culture, it's not wrong for a minor to be married, but in our culture, it is. And now we would say there's no absolute fact. Now, this might do a little better than the case that we just mentioned of murder. So like, is murder wrong? Well, now we don't have to say that if there's an individual murderer who thinks that it's not, that means that relative to them that it's not, because now the relativity is located at a higher source, the culture overall. So in our culture, we would say, yeah, for sure, murder is wrong. But if there are other cultures which practice, I don't know, human sacrifice or something, then they might argue that that's actually something that we must do in order to appease the gods and not to incur the wrath of the gods. So Jillian, you say this. What do you count as a child? Would 17-year-old count in that definition? Yeah, this is a bit of a legal distinction, but I guess in the United States and in most places it's 18 that's considered the age of adulthood and also consent. But even in the United States, the laws differ from state to state. There are states in the United States where you can legally marry at 16 because the age of consent is different from the age of adulthood. I didn't want to get into this can of worms, basically, so let's just assume we're talking about very young, underage children of like 14 or so. There are cultures, of course, in which such young girls would be wedded to a male suitor that's older. And looking at it from our culture, we would say this is wrong, this is abhorrent, this is a fundamental violation of morality. But in cultures which practice it, they would say that it's okay. But look, sometimes we think that there's stuff that's just wrong in and of itself, no matter what culture approves of it. If there's a culture somewhere practicing child sacrifice, then maybe you don't want to just say, hey, look, I can't say anything because according to them, that's okay. And over in my country, it's wrong. It's wrong. Maybe some people have a more deep feeling that that's absolutely wrong. That's universally wrong. Even if the whole world were to do it, everyone would be doing something wrong and evil in that case. So if you want to make even cultural criticism, if you want to be able to stand outside of a whole culture and a whole cultural practice and say that entire system is just wrong and there's something fundamentally unjust about this behavior, then you have to zoom over to moral universalism, because this is the only approach that's going to give you the power to say something is absolutely wrong. It's not just wrong to me, or it's not just wrong to me and my country or my people, but something's wrong in and of itself objectively. Now, some people don't believe that, right? And if you don't, then you're going to be more inclined towards relativism. These are just different theoretical options. I can't be the one to tell you one is the right one and one is the wrong one. But to those that are moral relativists, they really harbor that deep-seated intuition that there cannot be moral facts, that facts about morality don't exist, and there's just opinions. Maybe some are widely shared, maybe some are culturally shared, but they don't believe in moral absolutes. If you do believe in moral absolutes, though, you're going to hold to some version of universalism. And so on Thursday, this is now the end, when we start, we'll continue on that. We're going to talk more about moral universalist theories. There are two very important ones that have been developed in the West, and we're going to learn more about them. So by then, that's our last lecture. Next week, we'll just spend both meetings doing review, and I'll distribute a study guide before those meetings so that we can have productive review sessions. But for now, that's all I have for us for today. So guys, thanks again for all your help and the great contribution to the discussion that we've had. I'll see you guys back on Wednesday, and if there's anything else that you do need at all, just let me know, and you can email me and I'll be in touch. Okay then, so take it easy, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.